Alright, welcome to part 3 of the zombie horde tutorial. In this one we're just going to be finishing up a few things, and then we're going to be doing the Horrid Spawner, and then that should be it. So one thing I just wanted to note real quick, in between videos I added a Navmesh to the world, just like I did in part 1, just so we have something to walk on. And then another thing I should definitely mention as well, you'll see here, so let me spawn a bunch of zombies to kind of show you a problem. So I'm going to spawn like 60 of these guys. How many is that? 9. That's 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, that's 9, whatever. So, 1. Copy these guys. Copy these. Guys don't have to do this. I'm just trying to show you a little bug. Or not a bug, but a thing you'll need to change here if you have a lot. Alright, so let me run this. Alright, so you can see a lot of them chase me, but you can see some of them over here do not. And that's because I have more than 50 zombies. Now 50 is like this kind of magic number that they set by default, but you can change this number if you go to Edit, Project Settings, and then you search for Max Agents. See, it's set to 50. So however many zombies you want to have in your game maximum at one time is whatever you need to set this to. Now you don't want to go too high here because obviously this number is here for a reason. It's because it's expensive to have a lot of these. But I'm going to bump it up to 100 just so we can have a bunch of zombies since it's a horde. And it should be totally fine with that. And then we can just go ahead and close this. And so now you can see if I run it, they'll all chase me. I'm probably going to get stuck here. You see they're all chasing after me. And I can kill all of them and it works nice. All right, so now let's start working on this Horrid Spawner. I'm going to go ahead and delete some of these guys, just so we don't have a ton of them like this. There, let's delete those guys. Oh, actually, let's do something else kind of neat first before we work on the Horde Spawner. This is a thing you can do that just makes the zombies look a little bit more natural. So you can see they're all starting out facing this same way, which doesn't look too great when you start it. So let's just kind of give them a little bit of randomness when they spawn. We'll scale them a little bit, we'll randomize their rotation, and we'll randomize their speed, just to give them a little bit of uniqueness. So if we click on the zombie blueprint and we come up here to begin play, let's just do those 3 things real quick because I think it adds a lot. So we'll drag in the mesh. You'll say set world scale 3D. So we're basically just scaling the model. And we can split this node, and then we can say get random float, or get, random float in range? Yeah, random float in range. You don't want to go too crazy with this. I'd recommend like 0.9 and 1.1, because anything beyond that is going to look a little goofy. But just to give them a little bit of height difference. And then we can also randomize their rotation when they start out, so that they're not all facing the same way, or whichever way you place them at. They'll just kind of randomly spawn in a random direction. So again, we'll say set actor rotation. And then we also want to get a random rotation, so we'll go ahead and split this. And we only really care about the yaw. So again, let's just copy this, get random float in range, bring this in, and we'll set this from 0 to 360. And then finally, we'll randomize their walk speed. So we'll drag in the character movement component and say set max walk speed. And again, we'll copy this and paste. So the player by default is 600, so maybe we'll say the minimum is like 450 and the maximum is 700, so it's possible that they can be a little bit quicker than the player. And so now if we come to the viewport and we compile, you can see, oh, that's not in the constructor tip, never mind. So this is only going to happen in begin play, but you can see we come out here, and let me move these guys away a little bit. Oops. Move these guys down this way and kind of rotate them so you can see. So if I go ahead and run this, you should see they're all slightly different heights, and they're also all facing random directions, so they're not just all standing in the same direction. And I didn't have to do any extra work to like rotate them to face that way. So it's a little nice thing you can do. All right, so now let's start working on the Horrid Spawner. So the way the Horrid Spawner works is essentially you get to a location, and then it will spawn a bunch of zombies at a different location that's close by. Oh, and one thing I also did in between videos is I made this building smaller just so I can have a little alleyway here to spawn them in. So that's the location I'm going to spawn them in. But first we need to create our Horde Spawner, so let's right click and say Blueprint Class. We want to use Actor, and we'll call it BP_. Horde Spawner. And let's double click on this guy to open it up. And inside of here, we want to add a few components. So with the default scene root selected, we want to add a trigger, or not trigger, a box collision. And we'll call it the trigger box, because this is what's going to trigger the spawning of the zombies. And then select default scene root again. And then up here, say we want to add a scene component. So add the scene component. And this is just basically going to be used as the spawn location. And by default, the scene component doesn't have any visibility to it, so you can't tell where it is. So just so we can see where it is, just click on the scene component, and we're going to add a billboard component. And it adds this little dinosaur face. You can change it to like a zombie face over here if you have a different texture, but for now I'm just going to leave it as that. And then let's change the trigger box's size so it's a little bit bigger by default to like 500, 500, 500, something like this. And then the one thing we need to do with this trigger box is we need to change the collision on it a little bit. So if we select the trigger box and we come over here and we search collision, we want to change the collision preset to be a trigger. And then we want to make sure that the collision box does not interfere with our projectiles or our bullets, because obviously we don't want our bullets hitting this invisible box. And by default, they will. So to fix that, we can come to our edit project settings, and we want to add a collision type. So click on collision over here. We want to add an object channel rather. So click on collision on the left, and then under object channel, say new object channel, and call it projectile, like so. Hit accept. And then in the presets, open up the trigger preset, and we want to make sure that projectile is set to ignore, which it is by default, so that's good. And we can hit accept. And then we want to go back to our projectile. So go to our first person projectile. And we want to change the collision preset object type to be projectile if it's not already. For some reason, it updated on mine already. But we want to make sure that this is set to projectile. Compile, save all. And so just as a real quick test, let me just drag one of these guys into the world. And then let me make sure I can't shoot it with my projectile. So it's going through it, as you can see. So that's good. All right, so open up this Horrid Spawner again. So again, like I was saying, we want to make sure, we want to spawn zombies whenever the trigger box is overlapped with. So to do that, we can come to the event graph here, and we can right click on the trigger box and say add event, and add on component begin overlap. So this is going to get called whenever anything overlaps with that giant trigger box. And we want to make sure that the thing that overlapped with it is the actual player. So drag off of other actor, and we can say cast to first person character. So if it is a first person character, which is our player, then we want to do a couple things. The first thing we're going to want to do is disable collision on the trigger box. And the reason we want to do that is so that the player cannot continuously walk in and out of the trigger box and continuously trigger it over and over, spawning zombies over and over and over. We want to have some sort of cooldown on the trigger box so that, if the player is just walking in and out of it, it's not continuously spawning zombies. So to do that, we can say, okay, so once the player has overlapped with it, let's disable collision on the trigger box. So drag in the trigger box and say set collision profile name. And we want to set it to no collision. And doing this is going to make it so that this event is never going to get called because there's no longer collision on it, so obviously it's not going to be detecting any overlaps. But at some point we want to re-enable collision so that it can start working again. And to do that, we're going to use this handy little timer function called set timer by event. And what this is going to do is it's going to call whatever event you pass here after however many seconds you pass here. So for the event, we can drag off of this and say add custom event. And we'll just call this enable trigger. And then for the time, we'll pass like 30 seconds. So it's essentially saying after 30 seconds, re-enable the trigger box so that it will start spawning zombies again if you walk into it. And then we want to, inside of the enable trigger, we want to say set collision profile name for the trigger box. And we want to set it back to what it is by default. And if you remember, by default, we have it set to trigger. So we'll say trigger. And that's good. So now that we have the kind of cooldown system working for the Horde Spawner, the next thing we want to do is we want to request from the director that it spawns us some zombies. And to do that, we're going to use an event dispatcher again. So over here on the left, say event dispatcher, and we'll say request spawn. And we want this to take in a couple parameters. We want it to take in the number of zombies that we're requesting to spawn, and we want it to take in the location that we want them to spawn at. So hit this new parameter button twice, and then we want to change this one to an integer, and we want this one to be a vector. And so this one is going to be called the count, and this one's going to be called the location. And so off of this top node here, we'll drag in this call request spawn, hook it up. The count, so the count we can pass whatever number we want here. So if you wanted to spawn 10 zombies, you could pass 10, 5, 5. But a good thing to do might be to make that something that we can expose in the editor so that you can change it per instance of this Horrid Spawner. To do that, we can just create some variables over here. So I'm going to make two. I'm going to make one for the min and the max. So I'll make this little variable. We'll say horde size min. We'll make sure it's a integer, and we'll do the same thing, except we'll call it horde size max. And then we want to make sure that we click this little I, and that we also click blueprint read only, and you can select private as well for both of these. And that's just making it so that we can't change it after it's already set, and it's making it so that we can edit it per instance inside of the editor. And so now that we have our min and our max, we can just get a random number between these two values. So we'll say random int in range, and we'll pass in our min and our max, and that will be the count that we request to spawn. And remember, this is going to be going to the AI director. We haven't written that yet, but it's going to be going to the AI director, and the AI director is going to be the one spawning it, because he's the one responsible for kind of directing the AI and making sure things don't get out of control. And the location is going to be our scene. Maybe we should rename this to spawn point instead. So we'll drag in our spawn point, and we want to say get world location. Make sure you get world location and not like relative or something like that. You want the world location of it, and pass that in as well. All right, so now that we're requesting that we spawn zombies, we need somebody to actually fulfill this request. And like I was saying, that person is going to be the director. So let's go over to the director. And the director, in order to fulfill that request, needs to be bound to that request. And we can do that similarly to how we bound to the zombies on kill event dispatcher inside of begin play. So let's kind of drag this up a little bit. And we'll drag this to the right, and we'll make a sequence node. So I'm going to hold down the S key and left click. You can also get this by just searching for sequence, like that. So the sequence node, hook it up, and hook it up like that. But after we do this top part here, we want to kind of do the same type of thing, but for the horde spawners. So again, we're going to say get all actors of class, except this time, instead of BP zombie, we're going to be searching for BP horde spawner. Hook that up. And then we're going to loop over all these, so for each loop. And then we want to call a little function to handle spawning a new horde spawner. So just like we did for these functions over here, let's add a new function. So we'll say function, and we'll call it on horde spawner spawned. We'll drag it into private, and we'll make it private as well. And we want this to take in the horde spawner that was spawned. So input, we'll select the BP horde spawner, and we'll call this the horde spawner. And inside of here, we want to add this horde spawner to an array, just like we did for zombies. So I'm just going to do the same thing, promote to variable, and then we'll change this variable type. So if we select this over here, we'll change this to an array, and we'll rename it to horde spawners. Let me just delete this and drag it back in, and we'll say add. So we're adding the newly spawned horde spawner to our array of horde spawners, and then we want to bind to that request spawn event so that we're notified whenever it requests to spawn zombies. So make a little reroute node and say bind to request spawn, And then we need to make another event. So we'll say drag off this, create event. And we need an event to link this to, or a function to link this to. And so we need to make a function for it. So make a new function, call it on zombie spawn requested. Move it into the private category and set it to private. And then we need this to take in the same parameters that the event dispatcher used. So remember, those two parameters were the count and the location. So hit this button twice for new parameters. We want to change this to an integer, and we want to change this to a vector. And so this is going to be the count, and this is going to be the location. And so basically, inside of here, we just want to check that the number of zombies that we're going to be spawning is not more than the maximum zombies that are allowed in our game. And, well, actually, we haven't added a variable for that yet, so let's go ahead and do that next. So over here on the left, we'll add a new variable, and we'll call it max zombies. And we want to make it an integer, and we don't want it to be an array, so make sure it's not an array. And we want to check this little I so that it's exposed on spawn, because we want to be able to edit this, in the editor and not have to open up the blueprint to edit it. And like we did before, we'll set this to blueprint read only and private, since it's not going to be changing. And we'll set it to some default value like 100. So when they request that they want to spawn some zombies, we want to make sure, like, if they're requesting to spawn 500 zombies, we obviously don't want to spawn 500 zombies since our max zombies is set to only 100. But if that number is less than, or if that number plus the amount that are currently in the game are less than this max zombies, then we can spawn them all. Otherwise, we want to like clamp it to this value. So to do that, we want to check how many zombies are currently in the game. So to do that, we can just drag in the zombies, and we'll say get length, or just length. And this is going to return how many are in this array. And we want to subtract that from the max zombies that are allowed. So drag in max zombies and say int subtract integer minus integer, this one. Hook these guys up. And we want to take the minimum of this value and this value that was passed in. So we'll say int min. And that way, even if they pass us a ridiculously high number, we're never going to get more than the allowed max zombies. All right, so we want to take this number and do a loop by that amount of times. So we'll say for loop. Make sure you select for loop and not for each loop. We want for loop. Hook that up. The first index we want to set to 1, so it starts at 1. And then the last index we want to be the whatever this returns. So we're essentially looping over the number of zombies that we want to spawn, and we just want to call spawn zombie. So we'll say spawn actor from class. We'll pass in our BP zombie for the type. And for the location, we want to use this location that was passed in, but we don't want to spawn them all directly on top of each other. We want them kind of be spread out a little bit. And to do that, we can use this handy little function called get random. We can type get random radius. Which one do we want? Get random radius, point in radius. Yes, point in radius, this one. So this only gives us a location, which is actually all we need, even though this wants to transform. So we can just go ahead and split this and hook this up here. And since we added that code that's going to randomize the rotation of the zombies when they spawn, we don't need to worry about giving them random rotations here because it's going to happen when they get spawned, which is really nice. All right, so the origin is going to be our location. So I'm just going to say get location, hook that up. And then the radius can be like however big you want it to be. I'm going to just set it to something kind of small, like 200, so that they kind of spawn in a group clustered together. And that's the only thing we need to set here. So if we did this, it would kind of work, except some of the zombies would spawn inside of the ground because this point inside of a radius is actually like a sphere. So it goes, up and down inside the radius as well. So it might spawn them below the ground. And obviously we don't want that. We want them to spawn, or wait a minute. No, I think I said that wrong. No, this doesn't spawn them in a sphere. It just spawns them in the ground sometimes, because if you look at the zombies, their origin point is actually, I'm trying to figure out how to show this. Yeah, if you click on a zombie, you can see his origin is actually in the center of him. So if I told him to spawn like in the middle of the street, he's actually going to spawn right here. And sometimes the collision is just going to say, oh, he's below the ground. They're going to push him through the ground and he's going to die or whatever. So we don't want that. We want to add half of his height so that he spawns here, and then we push him up by whatever half of his height is. Oops. And to do that, we can just take a look at our zombie, and his capsule component is capsule component. If we look at his capsule half height, it's 88. So we just want to add 88 to the spawn point, the Z, and that will work just fine. So we can actually just unhook this real quick, and we'll say vector add, and then we can just pass 88 here for the Z, and hook that up. And now he'll be spawning so that his feet are actually on the ground. And then the last thing we want to do is call our onZombie spawn function so that this zombie gets registered with the system. Say onZombie spawn, and we'll pass in our zombie. Now it's still giving us an error, and that's just because we need to go back and hook up this event. So our create event, we need to set it to our onZombie spawn requested. If you don't see this here, then that means that there's a mismatch between your input parameters of your event dispatcher and the function that you created. So make sure that your event dispatcher and your function both have these count and location in this order. All right, save all of this good stuff. Let me just double check to make sure. Oh, okay, so we need to come back here to the begin play. We need to call on Horrid Spawner spawned and pass in the Horrid Spawner. And now I think we might be good to test this out. Just double check, I have everything hooked up, adds it, does it, spawns. Okay, so I think this is all good. So we can go and test this now. So go back to your world, wherever it is, and find a good spot where you want to test it at. I'm just going to test it right here. So drag in your Horrid Spawner, and it's pretty important how you modify it from this point. You kind of got to be a little bit careful that you're not doing the wrong thing. So if you want to move the location of it, I would recommend moving it with this selected, which is the root, so it moves the whole thing like this. So kind of figure out where you want to put it. And I also would not recommend scaling it. I would recommend, if you want to change the scale of it, to click on the trigger box and to set the box extents like this. So you can see it gets bigger and smaller when you change these numbers. This is like the more proper way to do it. So we'll set it to something like this. And then I also want it a little bit wider so it happens a little bit sooner. So we'll set it to like 1,000. Oops, not 100. 1,000. And we'll drag it down this way a little bit because he's going to be coming down the street. So as soon as he gets to this like little white sign right here, it's going to spawn all these zombies. Now you can see if you click on the spawn point is currently right here. And I guess we'll leave it like this for a second just so you can kind of see how it works. So they're going to spawn right in the middle of the street. So let me come over here. Now we need to set the horde size min and max. And currently they're both 0. We should actually probably change these to have some default values. So let's go to the VP horde spawn. And the min and the max size, let's set them to like 10 and 12 or something. Just give them some sort of default value so they're not defaulted to 0. And we'll just leave it at that for right now, but you can see if you wanted to make this one spawn more, you could just change it right here and it would spawn more zombies. So now let's go ahead and run this. Oops, I don't want to run it from there. I want to run it from over here. All right. So you can see at the top left it says 4 zombies, and they're all mad at me, so let's kill them. So we're going to get down, let's wait for it to get down to 0 zombies. All right, 0 zombies. Now as soon as I pass this white sign, it should spawn a bunch of zombies right in front of me. Oh, and there it does. Pretty close. And we can kill these guys. So obviously you wouldn't have it working like exactly like that where they just pop up right in front of you. You'd want it to be so they're around the corner. Oh, we got an error. Yes, so it's failing to spawn some of the zombies because they're spawning so close to each other. So what we need to do is we need to make sure back here, we just want to change this to like try to adjust spawn or try to adjust location, don't spawn if still colliding. And then we'll drag off of this and we'll say is valid. And so that way we're only trying to, you know, call on zombie spawned if it's actually successfully was spawned. Just kind of make this a little neater. So now if we go ahead and run this again. Oh, I keep doing that. Come back up here. So we can go and kill these guys. And I walk in my little trigger box, spawns a bunch of them. Can mow them down. And then we don't get any errors. All right. So that's working pretty nice, but obviously you would want to not have them just spawn in front of the player. So to make it so that they don't, we can select this Horde Spawner, and then if you select the spawn point specifically, you can just drag it to where you want it to be. So I'm going to drag it over here, make sure it's still on some sort of Navmesh. Move it back here. So now if we play this again, oops, I don't want to play it from there. Play it from over here. You'll see they'll spawn out of sight, and so it'll kind of make it look like, you know, the zombies have always been there, even though you don't have to. Oh, why did they spawn there? Oh, it's because I have two spawners in here. I just realized I have this one and I have this one. I don't know how I did that on accident, but just delete this guy. So now we only have the one Horde Spawner here, and they spawn over there. So let's try this again. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. I always do that. Spawn it outside of the trigger box. Kill these guys. And then walk, walk, walk. And they're spawned. And again, these guys were not here at the beginning of the game. They get spawned in later. And you can see if I leave and I come back into the trigger box, they're not spawning. But if I wait, I think we set it to 30 seconds. So let's give it a little bit. Just kind of come in and out of this trigger box. I don't remember exactly where the trigger box is, but it's somewhere on this road. Maybe should have set it to something lower than 30 seconds, but that's okay. Once I got this white sign. There we go. So I just spawned a bunch of them again. And you can make the Horde Spawner more or less complex, you know, make it more random on how it works, but that's basically, you know, the gist of it and the foundation of how it works. So yeah, I think that's pretty much the whole tutorial. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. I also have a link to my Patreon in the video, or in the description if you want to support me there. I'd really appreciate it. But yeah, I'll see you in the next video.